I will ask now Joan Ockman to join the floor. Before I will introduce you. So Joan Ockman is an architecture educator, historian, writer, and editor that you probably all know. Ockman works at Pennsylvania University, the School of Design. She taught also at Columbia University for 2 decades at the JSAP. In addition to Columbia and Penn, she has held teaching appointments at Harvard, Yale, Cooper Union, Graduate Center of City University of New York, and also the Berlage Institute in the Netherlands. Among her numerous publications are her award-winning anthology Architecture Culture 1943-1968, published in 1993, The Pragmatist Imagination, Thinking About Things in the Making, published at Princeton in 2001, and the last one that I will mention is Architectural School, 3 Centuries of Educating Architects in North America, which was published at MIT in 2012. So welcome. Kept it short.
Okay. End of the day, end of a long day, an interesting day. I want to thank Jana, like everyone else has, for putting this together, this provocative topic. I also have to apologize a little since I'm giving a different talk than the one announced. Oh, can you hear me now? Is that better? Do I have to turn it on, or what? I need to talk into it. Okay, I wish I had 3 hands because I've got 2 computers and a mic to deal with. But anyway, this talk is something I've actually worked on for many years. It's been revised and presented in different ways. I hope that this presentation will pick up on many things that have been touched on today at length or in passing, and it's a little long, so I hope I won't stretch you too much, but I'll talk fast and do my best here. So, Conjuring with Ghosts, Geists, a dialectical fairy tale. Some 40 years ago, Frederick Jameson was, I think, the earliest Marxist intellectual outside of architecture in the English-speaking world, not only to read Manfredo Tafuri seriously, but to precisely and incisively characterize his critical methodology as dialectical historiography. In Architecture and the Critique of Ideology, an essay published in 1985 in a little book titled Architecture, Criticism, Ideology, the proceedings of a conference organized by a study group in New York called Revisions, of which I was a member, together with Mary McLeod and 8 or 9 other young architectural colleagues, mostly young. Alan Cahoon was part of this. He was our eminence grise. Jameson compared Tafuri's writings on modern architecture to Adorno's Philosophy of Modern Music and Roland Barthes' Writing Degree 0. What Tafuri shared with these 2 other writers, according to Jameson, was, I'm quoting, the sense of necessity, of necessary failure, of closure, of ultimate unresolvable contradictions, and the impossibility of the future. Even if, as he added, quote, such histories of necessity and of determinate failure are equally inseparable from some ultimate historical perspective of reconciliation, of achieved socialism, of Marx's end of prehistory. I want to revisit this Marxist genre of dialectical historiography with you now, specifically in relation to Tafuri's book, The Sphere and the Labyrinth, published in Italian, as we've heard earlier in the day, in 1980, and translated into English in 87. The Sphere and the Labyrinth would mark a major turning point in the evolution of Tafuri's thinking and writing about modern architecture. But Jameson had not yet had the opportunity to read it when he wrote his paper. In fact, the book's translation was being prepared at the time, and a pre-publication of one of the chapters in the Sphere appears in Architecture, Criticism, Ideology. At the same time, if you will indulge me, and if only as a kind of methodological experiment of my own, in the context of reflecting today on Tafuri's farewell to writing about the history of modern architecture, I want to present a dialectical fairy tale of my own. And I should just, by the way, say, A Dialectical Fairy Scene was the title that Walter Benjamin originally envisaged for his magnum opus, the Arcades Project, but he decided against it because he felt it was impermissibly poetic. So let me plunge in here. Rainer Banham and Manfredo Tafuri may be taken as mirror images in more than just a physiognomic way. Tafuri famously denounced operative history, history written specifically to advance a particular architectural tendency and to shape a future direction of architectural practice. Yet it's apparent that as historians and cultural critics, both the Italian and the English writer were products of their respective ideological contexts and engaged in addressing what they saw as the most salient and urgent issues of their day. For Banham, hailing from a mainstream Labour Party background in Britain, but strongly drawn to American mass culture, this meant both advancing innovative technology and embracing the new 20th century zeitgeist. For Tafuri, rooted in Italian Marxist culture and its political and intellectual debates, it meant analyzing the contradictions and class conflicts inherent in late capitalism and tracing their historical mediations. Arguably, though, despite their differences, and even after the epochal changes that have occurred over the last 3 or 4 decades, many of the questions that continue to haunt our discipline and practice of architecture in the 21st century can still be situated between Banham's Archaeology of the Future and Tafuri's historical project. Banham's theory and design in the first machine age, 1960, culminates, as everybody knows, with the Dymaxion car and house, the latter a radically new environmental conception first formulated by Buckminster Fuller in the late 1920s. It begins in what seems to be a different world, represented by Tony Garnier's drawing for a national bank, a characteristic Beaux-Arts exercise that won the young French architecture student the Prix de Rome in 1899. Once in Rome, however, Garnier veered from his academic training, developing an extraordinarily far-sighted and ambitious scheme for an industrial city. This is why Banham places him at the threshold of his book. In his ideal city, Garnier embraces the new world of technological production while reaching back to utopian socialism. His objective is to establish a harmonious relationship between the unprecedented work world I did something wrong. The unprecedented work world ushered in by industrial modernity and modern dwelling. Banham admires Garnier's bold new vision, as he does that of other early modern architects who were deeply inspired by the machine age. Yet he takes them to task for neglecting to acquaint themselves with it very closely. In a later book, A Concrete Atlantis, 1986, celebrating the North American industrial vernacular of the turn of the century, he argues that, quote, the forms of factories and grain elevators were an available iconography, a language of forms whereby promises could be made, adherence to the modernist credo could be asserted, and the way pointed to some kind of technological utopia. But if the first generation of modern architects were adept at producing iconic images, they remain slow, in his estimation, actually to implement the new construction technologies in their buildings. With a handful of notable exceptions, Fuller, primary, the engineer's aesthetic that Le Corbusier exhorted his fellow architects to emulate remained just that for a long time, an aesthetic. World War II finally made the brave new world of 20th century technology a reality. It was a world that was thrilling but also threatening, especially for those who had just experienced its formidable powers of destruction firsthand. Initially trained as a mechanical engineer before going on to get his PhD in architectural history under Nicholas Pevsner, Banham never wavered in his belief in the emancipatory potential of modern technology. Those of his generation, quote, who interrupted their architectural training to fight a war in order to make the world safe for the modern movement, as he nicely put it, could ill afford to backpedal. In 1956, he found himself at odds with his friends Peter and Alison Smithson, whose new brutalist ethos he had previously championed in a long article in Architectural Review. Yet their atavistic installation for the exhibition This Is Tomorrow at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in London, produced in collaboration with artist Eduardo Palozzi and the photographer Nigel Henderson, appeared perverse to him. A low-tech, possibly post-apocalyptic bicycle shed, less Robbie the Robot, the mascot of the exhibition, than Samuel Beckett, it was antithetical in every way, at least ostensibly, to their Fuller-inspired House of the Future, a project for the Scottish Daily Mail's Ideal Home exhibition of earlier the same year. Yet it's also possible to interpret the latter project, the one on the right, with its claustrophobic interiority and its live mannequins dressed up in outre futuristic outfits while still partaking in a consumerist lifestyle, as an absurdist comment on the uncertain fate of a world now in the grip of the Cold War and the mutual assured destruction of an atomically armed world. Yet throughout his career, Banham remained largely indifferent to the ways technology served the interests of power, as well as to its ecological implications. He insouciantly affirmed the prerogatives of a gadget-obsessed consumer society and a throwaway economy, ignoring their relationship to an expanding military-industrial complex. His attack on the tendency that sprang up in Italy under the name of neo-liberty in the mid-50s, most famously represented by Gabetti and Isola's richly crafted facade for the Bottega d'Erasmo in Turin, and by the BBPR's medievalizing Velasca Tower in Milan, was directed at what he saw simply as a regression into historicist nostalgia. This led Ernesto Rogers, editor-in-chief of the journal Casabella, and the R in the BBPR acronym, to brand him custodian of frigid airs. Yet Banham remained an implacable foe of traditionalism in all its forms, and notwithstanding his freewheeling pop culture persona, serious in his demand that architects pursue innovative and audacious technical solutions. His book, The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, 1969, gave mechanical servicing its first careful critical history, something Siegfried Gideon's Mechanization Takes Command of 1948 had failed to do 2 decades earlier. Banham was also responsible for introducing into the history of modern architecture a handful of unorthodox and visionary figures who had been omitted from previous accounts. Besides his hero Fuller, these visionaries included Paul Scheerbart, an eccentric German poet who authored a tract on glass architecture in 1914 that combined utopian fantasies of an all-glass world with both practical and remarkably prescient environmental ideas, inspiring Bruno Taut and the glass chain circle around him after World War I. He also sang the praises of the futurist architect Saint Elia, who perished at the age of 28 on a World War I battlefront shortly after drafting his Città Nuova, glorifying modern industry. Coincidentally, Scheerbart and Saint Elia died at the beginning of the war, but they had diametrically different politics. Scheerbart was a pacifist who travestied Prussian militarism in his poetic fantasies, while Saint Elia was an Italian irredentist whose drawings depicted a machine universe of brute power that went well beyond Garnier's peaceful cité industrielle, and whose mentor, Marinetti, upheld war as a form of social and cultural hygiene. But these contradictions didn't trouble Banham much. His primary aim in theory and design was to awaken the architects of the second machine age, his own generation, to the fact that they were already living in an epoch of futurism realized. Architects in the post-World War II era needed to take stock of the world of new technology that was now becoming available, ranging in its cornucopia of new options from domestic electronics and commercial flights to synthetic chemicals and television sets. Quote, "In the early 50s, we stepped into a London that Boccioni had described clairvoyantly. We were at home in the promised land that the futurists had been denied," he wrote in an article published in 1960, the same year Theory and Design appeared. No wonder we found in the futurists long-lost ancestors, even if we were soon conscious of having overpassed them. Overpassed or not, they seem to speak to us on occasions in precisely the detail that the ghosts spoke to Hamlet. Inspired not just by Vanham's vivid polemic, futurism's ancestral ghost finally awakened from its slumber in the 1960s, wafting or walking back into architectural consciousness in the form of colossal urban hardware like Archigram's Walking City, or more personalized plugins like Banham's own Enviro Bubble, only to retreat once again during the next couple decades in a period that saw a backlash against a high-tech positivistic architecture, as Banham himself recognized in his retrospective book, Megastructure, subtitled Urban Futures of the Recent Past. At the same time, the postmodernism that followed hard on the 60s was, for Banham, little more than a hokey-jokey affair. Close to 4 decades after Banham's death, in one more turn of the wheel, the Geist of technology, with its uncanny proclivity for disappearing and appearing, is back. Today, architects are fully on board with the recent revolutions in digital and environmental technology and eager to collaborate with advanced engineering in more than a superficial way. In this sense, 21st century architecture, now in the epoch of artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnology, and other once wild dreams, and so in its third or even fourth machine age, depending again on how you periodize, has finally become modern. Tafuri's ghost? Not so much. The hegemony of capitalism in the 2000s hardly offers more reason than it did in the 1970s to place anachronistic hopes in design, as the Venice historian put it in the concluding salvo of his most polemical book, Architecture and Utopia. Disparaging architects and critics who are continuing to put forward rationalistic design methodologies as solutions to ever more complex urban and architectural problems, Tafuri heaps scorn. Heaps scorn on. Oh my. Oh, online. I see. Okay. Okay. Keep going. Oh, all right. Can keep going. Okay. Okay. Tafuri heaps scorn on Tomás Maldonado, for one, author of a 1970 book titled La Speranza Progettuale. But he might just as well have had in mind Banham, who Tafuri elsewhere labels the paladin of technological orthodoxy. Like Jameson, Tafuri viewed capitalism as the defining instance of modernity. He therefore somewhat petulantly insisted on referring to the architecture of his day as hypermodern, rejecting the newly current term postmodern. Postmodern implied that latter-day capitalism had somehow accelerated to the point of its own demise at the end of the 20th century, rather than, in fact, broadening its imperial reach. To be post-modernity meant to have transcended the existing relations of production, and this prospect hardly appeared to be on the horizon. Therefore, as Tafuri declared in a note written in 1970 for the second edition of his book, Theories in History of Architecture, in a sentence tinged sarcastically with 1960s counterculture lingo, as well as Marxist rhetoric, no architecture for a liberated society could be produced in advance of a full-scale overturning of the existing political economy. For the present, there could be, at best, a class criticism of architecture, a critique of architecture as a techno-aesthetic practice in the service of a hegemonic system. In fact, it wasn't modernity qua capitalism, that Tafuri saw as coming to an end in the 1970s, but rather the ideological construct of modernism. If for Banham, a true modern architecture had finally begun to become a reality after World War II, for Tafuri, modernism was already history. Its most radical experiments had taken place in the 1920s. An elated but naive response to the new processes of modernization, the avant-garde of modernism had confidently assumed it could contribute its expertise to the task of constructing a new society, a better world. But the successive crises of totalitarianism, a Second World War, and global consumer culture had revealed the limited agency that was actually available to architects, disabusing them of their heroic illusions. This historical experience, which climaxed in the failed revolutions of 1968, the 60s and 68, coincided with Tafuri's arrival at Venice's architecture school that year, 68, where his critical perspective would further evolve. In the wake of these disillusionments, Tafuri would bid a somewhat more reconciled addio to modernism a decade later in his book, The Sphere and the Labyrinth, subtitled Avant-Gardes and Architecture from Piranesi to the 1970s. Published at exactly the halfway point of his career, the book is altogether original in conception, ambitious and literary in aspiration, formidable in scholarship, and not without its own contradictions. It counterposes individuals, groups, and movements that strove to play a determinate role in constructing new societies with other developments that emerged out of the same historical subsoil but responded differently. Thus, in a book that purports to be about avant-gardes in architecture, Tafuri juxtaposes experimental projects by radical constructivist architects in the Soviet Union with large-scale urban schemes by academically trained planners. Unbuilt European high-rise projects with Art Deco skyscrapers in New York. The total theater of Gropius and Meyerhold with the Hollywood spectacles of Busby Berkeley. Counter-history, as much as history, the book brings together a series of essays that Tafuri wrote over the course of the 70s, resulting in a grand but disparate and discontinuous récit, grand narrative. The historian plays a remarkably displays a remarkably rich and poetic imagination as he weaves the book's master metaphors through the narrative, sphere and labyrinth. This is the first and last image in the book, by the way. As the subtitle of the book also makes clear, the book is conceived from a presentist position. Just as Banham's theory and design in the first machine age was written from the standpoint of the second machine age, Tafuri's book is an intense reaction to the rise of postmodernism and post-structuralism. More specifically, it's an attempt to reckon with a neo-avant-garde that was taking center stage both in Italy and on the international scene in his own time. Not surprisingly, Tafuri had deep misgivings about this repetition phenomenon, which, a la Marx, he saw as farce more than tragedy. In my estimation, The Sphere and the Labyrinth is Tafuri's most adventurous and most dramatic book. Yet relative to his other books, it's been somewhat neglected since its publication. No doubt the date it appeared, the same year that the Strada Novissima appeared at the first Biennale of Architecture in Venice, themed around the presence of the past, as well as its extraordinary density and unconventional narrative, these things have made it off-putting to a lot of readers. Stylistic idiosyncrasies and a host of linguistic issues, some having to do with translation for those of us not reading it in the original, haven't helped. And to mention one idiosyncrasy, rather telling and slightly even amusing one for a Marxist, one of Tafuri's favorite locutions, which you'll find at the start of many sentences, is, "It is no accident that." Having personally, has spent almost 4 decades working through this book, studying it, learning from it, and teaching it, I can only repeat to my students when they open it for the first time something that has also been said of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. You can't read The Sphere in the Labyrinth. You can only reread it. One of the more widely read parts of the book, essays in the book, partly because, as we heard earlier today, it was initially published in Opposition's Journal, is the remarkable theoretical and methodological prolegomenon, the historical project that serves as its introduction. The historical project, the historical project, note that in that title, the word project appears in scare quotes, another favorite tick of Tafuri. Back up. Tafuri's 2 major prior theoretical pronouncements, Theories in History of Architecture and Architecture in Utopia, the latter based on a polemical article that had appeared earlier in Contropiano, were declaratory in tone, verging in the second book on stridency. In the historical project, the author's voice is more interrogative, searching, self-searching, indeed deeply conflicted. Project, progetto, and its architectural vocabulary word in Italian, takes on privileged status as here applied to the vocation of the historian himself. Invoking Freud, Tafuri draws an analogy between psychoanalysis and historical analysis, both activities laborious and interminable, their conclusions always provisional. From this perspective, the critical historian's task is a rather Sisyphean one, to construct a meticulous account of events, only to subject it once again and again to new questions. This is to prevent it from becoming set in stone, a canonical interpretation, a new myth, an ideological formation, an institution. Tafuri begins his introduction with a quote from a book by Carlo Ginzburg and Adriano Prosperi, Giochi di Pazienza, of 1975, in which the writing of history is likened to assembling a jigsaw puzzle or playing a game of solitaire. But just when the pieces all seem to fall neatly into place, as Ginzburg and Prosperi warn, the historian needs to guard against being seduced by his own ingenuity. Other ways of putting things together may be equally plausible. The project of critical history is, in this sense, always an act of putting received understandings into crisis. Notably, the words criticism and crisis share a common etymology, and as such is the opposite from the propagandistic aims of operative history. But it's also the nonlinear and contradictory nature, the dialectical character of reality itself that makes it necessary to write history in the plural, as Tafuri now affirms in The Sphere in the Labyrinth. In Theories and History of Architecture, written under the sway of a more orthodox and scientific Marxism, he had unquestionably presumed, as the play between singular and plural, and that title implies, that while there might be multiple theories of history, there could only be one history, historical history, one true one. By the time he writes his introduction to The Sphere in the Labyrinth, though, he has abandoned this singular view, influenced in part by the longue durée perspective of the Annales School, but now unavoidably also under the impact of the post-structuralism that had overtaken the previously dominant structuralism in French literary and intellectual circles in the 1960s. Tafuri struggles to reconcile Marxism with a radically anti-essentialist perspective. Many of the leading post-structuralist thinkers, from Foucault, Barthes, and Lacan, to Derrida and Deleuze, make cameo appearances in the historical project. And Tafuri acknowledges their contributions to contemporary thought, maybe especially Foucault. But he does not conceal his distrust and indeed distaste for their work. While he can no longer afford to ignore their ideas, he is wary of their textual games and even more, their flagrantly depoliticized discourse. At the same time, he cannot but bitterly reaffirm the conclusion that he has himself reached in his earlier books with respect to architecture's political efficacy. Architecture as politics is by now such an exhausted myth that it's pointless to waste any more words on it. Disconcertingly, however, the doubt and self-questioning that pervade the historical project, written in 1977 and published in oppositions, as I mentioned, after all but one of the other essays in The Sphere and the Labyrinth, disconcertingly, this doubt and self-questioning do not carry through the rest of the book. This is one of the book's deep contradictions, indeed an unconscious confirmation of the dialectic. The 5 chapters that make up the book's central section, which is titled The Adventures of the Avant-Garde from the Cabaret to the Metropolis, concern the early 20th century avant-gardes, plural note, who are presented at varying scales of operation, from the theater to the metropolis, and in the context of 3 different world systems, as he calls them, likely adopting that rubric from Emanuel Wallerstein: Soviet communism, American capitalism, and German social democracy. But whether Tafuri is writing about the USSR of the new economic policy, the pre-Depression United States, or the rightward-tending Weimar Republic, each chapter ends up tracing a depressingly familiar arc. Like a theme with variations, he repetitively makes the case that by the beginning of the 1930s, many of the most idealistic modern architects and planners had become cogs in the techno-bureaucratic machinery of their respective systems of production, if not exiles. This insistent refrain does not fail to give his narrative an overall sense of closure, calling into question that open-ended jigsaw puzzle of the introduction. Symmetrically bracketing the 5 central chapters of The Sphere and the Labyrinth are 2 initial chapters related to Piranesi and 2 concluding ones focused on the architecture culture of the 1970s. In the opening chapter, Tafuri implicitly takes the wicked, virtuously wicked 18th century Italian architect draftsman as a herald of the 20th century avant-gardes, the first to discover the potential of transgression and paper architecture as subversive strategies for architectural practice, and a model for those in the future who would strive to overturn the aesthetic and professional codes of their own day. This idea gets concretized in the 2nd chapter, in which Tafuri links the proto-avant-gardist Piranesi to the Soviet film director Sergei Eisenstein, trained as an architect before he started to work in theater and film, and shows the influence of Piranesi's Carceri etchings on Eisenstein's theory of montage. Oops, I don't want to be there yet. Hold on. By this connection, explicitly also made by Eisenstein himself, Tafuri leaps over the entire bourgeois 19th century. In the final 2 chapters, we get the completion of Tafuri's narrative arc, arriving at the architectural vanguard of his own day. What might have seemed an unusual inclusion in a book on avant-gardes, namely a chapter on the New York skyscraper of the 20s, of all things, turns out to have been crucial to this denouement, which unfolds in chapters respectively titled L'architecture dans le boudoir and The Ashes of Jefferson. Among the new architectural ghosts who entered the scene is Louis Kahn. Tafuri casts Kahn as a late modern master whose lingering civic idealism is a futile late effort to channel the Enlightenment spirit of Jefferson. In Tafuri's view, Kahn's Jeffersonian project of reestablishing the heroic foundations for a new civic realm of public institutions is steeped in mystification, reflecting the Philadelphia architects' nostalgia for a world that has been irrevocably shattered. Its mirror image, the dialectic again, is the irreverent realism of Robert Venturi, Kahn's heretical protege, who emerges in Tafuri's narrative economy as Kahn's dialectical other. He writes, to the promise of Kahn, communication is possible by giving voice to institutions, Robert Venturi has responded with the following objection. The only institution is the real, and only the real speaks. If Kahn produced a school of mystics without religions to defend, Venturi has in fact created a school of the disenchanted without any values to transgress. In Tafuri's view, Venturi's recourse to the real constitutes an uncritical embrace of the degraded world of commodities. As such, it offers a would-be radical architecture no path forward. For Tafuri, Kahn's and Venturi's strategies are equally untenable, and they come in for the same harsh verdict. I won't read this, quoting part. The order without center of Kahn and the ambiguous to ambiguous of Venturi find their fluctuating point of convergence in a new image system made up of dreams of non-existent institutions or of nightmares dominated by the crowding together of the icons of cosmic merchandization. Banham, of course, had a very different view of these two architects. Responsible for the bold Richards Medical Laboratories in Philadelphia, Kahn, I don't know what's happening, had the courage, in Banham's view, to hang the building's guts on the exterior. Such unprecedented, one could say fetishistic, exhibitionism not only gave embodiment to Kahn's seminal thesis of servant versus served space, but rebalanced architecture's conventional compositional hierarchy in favor of the technical systems. As for Venturi and his partners, although concerned more with the signs and symbols than with technology, their work at least had the merit of being in tune with the zeitgeist, mining the energies of mass culture. In this sense, learning from Las Vegas usefully extended the line of thinking that the Smithsons had initiated in the mid-50s with their manifesto, but today we collect ads. Uh-oh. From Tafuri's standpoint, however, the Venturi's trip to the Strip was frivolous and gratuitous, an act of trivialization or even abjection on the part of an elite but disillusioned profession. In fact, Tafuri discerned the hedonism evident in the postmodernist projects of not just the American, but also the European neo-avant-gardes harbored an undercurrent of sadomasochism. I think we're going to be able to get it back?
We need the slide for that.
Yeah, we need the slide for this. A few other slides are. Just watching time. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. Okay. about there. Well, let's go from there. No, I'm not there yet either. Okay. I don't know where I am. Okay. Okay. We were just about at sadomasochism, right? Let's go one more here. Tafuri discerned an undercurrent of sadomasochism, ultimately a symptom of the acknowledgement by late 20th century capitalist architects of their own impotence. To what, then, could I have aspired in my craft? Aldo Rossi asks rhetorically at this very same date in his book, A Scientific Autobiography. Certainly to small things, having seen that the possibility of great ones was historically foreclosed. Tafuri thus saw the jokes, that's his word, of Venturi and Koolhaas, the sophisticated ironies of Isozaki and Krier, the flippancy of Hollein and Tigerman, as the flip side of the hermetic play with architectural language of Rossi, Jim Sterling, and the Five Architects of New York. Once again, framed dialectically, both excess and austerity were defensive postures, reflecting a radical scaling down of disciplinary ambitions. Lurking behind the spirit of Jefferson, Tafuri detected yet another Enlightenment figure, his evil twin, the Marquis de Sade. Here, Sadom is explicit, Tafuri writes of a project by Mario Gondelsonis, an Argentine emigre architect and theorist working at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, think tank founded in 1967 by Peter Eisenman, chief theoretician and impresario of the Five Architects group. The specter of the 120 days of Sodom, Tafuri states, roves about among the astonished dreams of the heirs of an enlightenment resurrected from its ashes. Like the libertine in Sade's novel, Philosophie dans le Boudoir, 1795, from which Tafuri takes the title of the essay, the late 20th century architects preferred to carry out their activities inside a chamber well sealed off from an all too threatening reality. Only in such hermetic surroundings could the languages of battle forged by the avant-gardes of the 1920s be safely decanted into languages of pleasure. Despite their often exquisite products in Tafuri's view, the architects of the 70s offered little more than arresting formal and cerebral distractions. There's clearly no social value in this, he declares. But had not Tafuri himself insisted that it was futile to place hopes in design? What other avenues were open to the neo-avant-gardes of the 1970s? Among the experiences that triggered the writing of the book's final chapter, The Ashes of Jefferson, was a 3-day visit by Tafuri to the United States in the spring of 1974. His membership in the Communist Party prevented him from obtaining a longer visa. In a sort of autobiographical projection, the chapter opens with a description by Tafuri of New York as a new Venice. The source of this metaphor was an article written by Peter Blake in 1971, published in New York Magazine, reflecting the excitement of many New York architects and planners at the turn of the 70s about the imminent transformation of the city, and especially its waterfront, under the liberal Republican administration of John V. Lindsay. Ambitious projects like the World Trade Center and a first phase of high-rise housing on Roosevelt Island were going up. Yet by the time of Tafuri's visit 3 years later, the mood was already changing. New York was in economic straits owing to a global oil crisis, post-Watergate trauma, and the dismantling of the world financial system established after World War II. A major competition for a second phase of housing on the northern end of Roosevelt Island, a thin strip of land floating in Manhattan's East River, would be announced a few months later after Tafuri's visit, only to be abruptly canceled as the capital of capitalism teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. This ultimately relegated the competition entries to paper speculations presented in an exhibition held in October, November of 75 at the Architectural League, accompanied by a modest catalog. The submissions ranged from more to less realistic, tilting toward the latter once the event turned into an ideas competition only. Among those singled out for commendation by the jury was a contextual scheme by Robert A.M. Stern, R.I.P., that paid tribute to Jane Jacobs and Oscar Newman. More reflective of current neo-avant-garde tendencies was a project by O.M. Ungers, which took Manhattan's grid as the basis for a typology of urban fragments. A related project was submitted by Ungers' then protege, Rem Koolhaas, working in collaboration with Ilya Zingelis. Both Ungers and Koolhaas's projects had affinities with what was known since the Milan Triennale of 1973, which was curated by Rossi, as neo-rationalism, although in Koolhaas's case, formalist alienation was transformed into a more playful or delirious urban scenario, its imitation of Manhattan's syncopated block and grid pattern distinguishing it from Ungers' all-grid. Another project, titled in Arcadia, Ego, came from a team that included former Archigram members Peter Cook and Ron Herron. Carried out in New York at Eisenman's Institute, it ironically evokes the cylindrical parking structures of Louis Kahn's celebrated Philadelphia plan, but now repurposed in a vein clearly more Sadian than Kahnian, as defensive six-story residential silos. As Tafuri rightly perceived, the 1974 competition for a still undeveloped site on the periphery of New York's urban delirium was haunted by Enlightenment dreams, or more precisely, nightmares. Picking up on Nietzsche's and Zimmel's classic essays on Venice, Tafuri portrays New York in The Ashes of Jefferson as a place where fascination, artificiality, and alienation converge into a system of superficial signs. But there's a coda to this story of Roosevelt Island that even Tafuri could hardly have imagined, and I'm just going to flash through this. Some of you may know that after Lou Kahn's death, some of his followers found the funding and the energy to actually get this thing built on the tip of southern tip of Roosevelt Island, exactly the original site. One can only imagine what Tafuri might have made of this simulacrum and its architectural nostalgia. Be that as it may, Jefferson and Sod are not the only spiritual interlocutors in The Ashes of Jefferson. There's another who has gone unnoticed to date. And I've been very happy, and I was delighted to listen to Lucas Scanzi earlier today on this. In a long autobiographical poem titled The Ashes of Gramsci, written in 1954, Pier Paolo Pasolini bade a bitter, finer farewell to the spirit of Italy's most important Marxist political theorist and co-founder of the Italian Communist Party, Antonio Gramsci, whose democratic populist philosophy Pasolini had revered as a young man. Mourning the passing of an era when it was still possible to imagine a public realm organically connected to the social and political life of the working class, Pasolini writes elegically, "But I, with a conscious heart of one who can live only in history, will I ever again be able to act with pure passion when I know our history is over?" Like Jefferson in the American context, Gramsci in the Italian one belonged to an all but vanished society. The Ashes of Gramsci, a long autobiographical poem of 1957 by Pasolini, one of his most famous writings, shares with Tafuri's essay, The Ashes of Jefferson, not only a deep disillusionment with institutionalized Communist Party politics, but also a judgment on history. Pasolini viewed the neo-avant-gardia that had emerged in Italian literature by the early 1960s as professionally compromised. And like Tafuri in architecture, he saw the new generation of Italian literati as indulging in empty language games, Gramsci's name is never mentioned by Tafuri in The Sphere and the Labyrinth, but he's a haunting, absent presence. Not long after completing The Sphere and the Labyrinth, Tafuri announced that he henceforth intended to confine his scholarly attention to the study of the Renaissance. His decision to withdraw from contemporary architectural discourse was received by many in Italy and elsewhere as an act of defeatism, indeed a betrayal. Yet in a brief preface to his last book, The Ricerca del Rinascimento, which appeared in 1992, 2 years before his death, Tafuri makes clear that he never really relinquished his original historical project. Employing the critical instruments at the historian's disposal, he writes in the preface to this final opus, we may propose to enlarge the scope of the critical questions operating within contemporary architectural culture through an elaboration of mourning. As the statement makes explicit, the Ricerca, like Tafuri's many previous studies on the Renaissance, was not only about the architecture of a distant period. Rather, by returning to the threshold of the era conventionally known as modern, Tafuri intended to take as his point of historiographic departure the space where the present finds its problems. It's in this long ago beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries that the genealogy of many late 20th century architectural experiences was still traceable. In the first professionalized encounters between architects and their rich patrons, in the tensions between classical ideas of order and new scientific discoveries, in the disparities between idealized architectural representations and the realities of modernizing cities. At the same time, such a genealogy did not come without its accumulated body of psychosocial affects, I should say. Hence the need for an elaboration of mourning. This is a difficult phrase to parse. Both Marx and Nietzsche had, in different ways, anticipated that would be the task of a modernist culture to absorb and introject and reconcile modernity's destructive fallouts. And in the 1930s, picking up on Nietzsche, Walter Benjamin had attempted to put a less tragic face on things. Quoting Benjamin, the destructive character is young and cheerful, for destroying rejuvenates because it clears away the traces of our own age. It cheers because everything cleared away means to the destroyer a complete reduction, indeed a rooting out of his own condition. Benjamin hoped that the decline of art's privileged status and quasi-religious mystique would lead to the democratization of culture, a withering of the art object's aura. So he willed himself to believe. Other intellectuals were much less sanguine. The Austrian art historian Hans Sedlmayr, conservative Catholic, also Nazi sympathizer in the 30s, decried the subordination of humanistic values to purely technical ones, lamenting the loss of center that modernity had engendered. Another scholar, whom Tafuri singles out in his preface to the Ricerca, the Romanian emigre art historian Robert Klein, characterized the passage from Renaissance perspective to Cézannean abstraction as a slow agony of the referent, the undoing of a representational system that once had correlated with the natural world. These were different ways of describing the same overall experience. I'm almost done, I promise you. But by Tafuri's time, there was one more loss to reconcile, that of modernism itself. Modernism purported to be compensatory and redemptive, a meta-strategy for transvaluing all the other losses into gains. But by the 1970s, this project too had collapsed. Mourning, Freud writes, in mourning and melancholia is a longing for something that can never return, a response to the shattering of a cherished relationship. It has two possible outcomes. Either the subject successfully completes the work of grieving and moves on, or else she or he continues to brood, becoming permanently melancholic, with loss becoming integral to the subject's identity. Tafori's project of elaborating the history of mourning was an effort to come to grips with disillusionment, to exorcise despair through the writing of history. The dialectic was a way to give form, at least narrative form, to history's formlessness. It might even allow the historian, as British art historian T.J. Clarke suggests in his book, Farewell to an Idea, Episodes from a History of Modernism, 1999, a book in many ways kindred in spirit to The Sphere and the Labyrinth, finally to make peace with reality. I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy, Richard Burton confessed in 1621 in his Anatomy of Melancholy. Let us replace the word anguish with a more neutral term like completion, Tafori proposes in his preface to the Ricerca. How successfully Tafori accomplished the work of mourning for the completion of modernism by the time of his death at age 58 is hard to say. After 1985, as we've said, he rarely addressed contemporary architecture directly. Many who could not abide the bleakness of his diagnosis, and in any case were eager to move on, felt an acute need to oublier Tafori, to exorcise his ghost. Indeed, his critique would have a crippling effect on the next generation of Italian architects and give architectural criticism itself a bad name, one that has persisted to the present day, figuring in recent post-critical debates. Yet are not these recent debates themselves symptomatic of a persisting trauma in our own period, now that we're presumably postmodern? The mournfulness of the late modern architect may seem passé and even histrionic, and it's possible to read The Sphere and the Labyrinth like that. I will forewarn you. But how many degrees of separation exist between ourselves and the cemetery consecrated by Tafori, or here John Hayda, to the ashes of modernist architecture? This is surely a problem for a dialectical historiography, but we obviously don't have time to explore further here. Still, if there can be any justification in the year 2025 for maintaining optimism of the will against pessimism of the mind, Gramsci again, it may have to do with the expanded role architects are being called upon to play in coping with the new challenges of the 21st century world, not least accelerating planetary urbanization and an environmental crisis of huge proportions. In this context, architects may be less inclined to produce the kind of negligible objects that Tafori accused them of contriving in the 1970s. At the same time, Tafori's injunction in L'Architecture dans le boudoir remains more pertinent than ever for future architectural practitioners and thinkers. Whoops, I meant to flash that when I was talking about the threats or the apocalyptic nature of our own time. All right, this is the quote that I want to read with you quickly. To shift the focus from what this is from the final chapter of The Sphere and the Labyrinth, to shift the focus from what architecture wishes to be or wishes to say toward what building production represents in the economic game means that we must establish parameters of reading capable of penetrating to the heart of the role played by architecture within the capitalist system. It will never be repeated too often that when wishing to discover the secret of a magician's tricks, it's far better to observe him from backstage than to continue to stare at him from a seat in the orchestra. Tafori's here rephrasing the argument made by Walter Benjamin in The Author as Producer, written in 1934. Both Benjamin and Tafori, following Marx, understood that consciousness is not enough. The question is how to convert knowledge into action, how to negate negation. While talk of revolution may have a bracingly militant sound to it these days, the route to change may possibly be more through a retooled pedagogical culture, not one that churns out new technicians, but produces new kinds of producers who keep knowledge from curdling into cynicism. While this means taking a longer, more evolutionary view of things, Gramsci, yet again, the best hope for advancing a critical praxis of architecture may well lie in the transformation of architecture education. Meanwhile, it will be worthwhile not only to rethink the respective messages of Banham and Tafori, but to read the one against the other. We said earlier that Banham's ghost would be gratified to see architects becoming more knowledgeable and sophisticated in relation to the technological instrumentalities with which they operate. Such leading-edge knowledge is undoubtedly essential. But technology is not neutral, especially in the hands of advanced capitalism. Tafuri's unquiet spirit continues to remind us of this. On the other hand, as Banham knew, to disapprove of a bad reality from the high perch of academia and of rarefied intellection is likely to mean having little real effect on things. To read Banham and Tafuri together, to read each of them critically, historically, dialectically, is to begin to imagine an architecture that goes beyond either technological triumphalism or historical hopelessness.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Michaela. Michael, sorry. Thank you for the talk. And because it's already 6 p.m. and we are supposed to leave by 6 p.m., I just wanted to give one maybe chance for a question that needs to be asked now or be told later. So does anyone have this one question that is? So I will ask you then if you want to discuss the topic and ask questions, open the debates that were being presented here, to do it after the talk. And I'll give a final word to Jana. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to thank you all for your patience and attendance. If anyone wants a book, it's your last chance. Also, we'll be sharing the video recordings from this day. So we have a YouTube channel. It's called Prague Axiomatic Circle. But the easiest way is just to make sure that you sign the presence sheet, because we can easily send the video recordings to your email as a mailing list. So that's probably the best way. And also, if you haven't signed, then we need your signature. That's mandatory. You can't avoid that, sorry. And otherwise, thank you so much to all. Thanks so much to speakers. It was an intense day. And sorry for the technical issues. And thanks to everyone at Zoom.
And thank you, Jana.
Thank you, Jana.